With respect to China, it's a very interesting phenomenon that when Nixon liberalized the access of foreign ownership of U.S. debt, there were very strict statutory limitations on how much debt a foreign interest could buy. And those restrictions, interestingly enough, as we ran to the max of our credit card, we called the credit card company and said, hey, could you raise our credit limit? And Congress was willing to oblige. So there were statutory limits. Every time we maxed those limits, we called Congress and said, hey, could you push the limit up? Could you push the limit up? And could you push the limit up? By the time we got to the Reagan administration's second term, we pretty much said, screw it. We don't want the limit anymore. So can we just have a unlimited line of credit? Now, the fascinating thing was, and this is one of the great misstatements in public media right now, which is when China got tired of buying our debt, which happened October a year ago, when they actually weren't showing up for the purchase of long-term treasuries, a huge number of people were shocked. Why is China not showing up to buy long-term treasuries? It turns out the reason why is they'd gotten to a point where they actually essentially had a veto vote as a minority shareholder. Think through this. Basic kind of rules of corporate structures. 2/3 is typically viewed as a majority interest. And after you get something which is that third plus one vote, you've effectively decapitated the majority shareholder. Because if you want to vote against them, you can. And unfortunately, your vote actually matters. And if you look at what China has done both directly and in cooperation with other treasury and reserve holdings around the world, you find out that when they hit their essential third blocking vote position, they were no longer interested in long-term treasuries. And what the public hasn't been overly informed of is that we're not selling a bunch of long-term treasuries right now. We're selling a lot of short-term treasuries. Now, the problem with a short-term treasury is the only way you can repay it when you don't have positive growth of your economy is you have to refinance it. That's a tiny problem because those maturities are 5-year maturities, not 10, not 15, not 20, not 30-year maturities. They're 5-year maturities. If you think of where we are in this economic cycle, you find yourself against a very interesting wall, and that is that we both have unbelievable deficit spending, unbelievable national debt, and unfortunately a GDP which is not even keeping up with the base treasury yield that we have to have. So when it comes to refinancing, we're actually going to be in a situation where that short-term treasury purchase, which a lot of sovereigns have been making over the last several years, last 2 years predominantly, are going to need to be refinanced in 3 years. Now, oddly enough, on a macro level, what China and the US Treasury is doing is actually reflected in what happened with the AIG bailout. There's a funny thing about bankruptcy, because in bankruptcy, the trustee stands in the shoes, if you will, of the entity that has been taken over by the trustee. So now the trustee is obligated to disclose what the assets and what the liabilities are. There's a tiny problem. If a bankruptcy trustee, for example, stepped into AIG and had to, in court, manifest the list of exposures, the liabilities, and the assets, and the other piece of bankruptcy is everybody who alleges to have a liability has to step up to the plate and say, hey, I have a claim against that now illiquid or insolvent counterparty. You would not only find that AIG had an insolvency problem, but you'd find out that all the banks had counterparty insolvency problems. And you wouldn't just find it out kind of in the theoretical sense of you'd know who the counterparties are, which you can pretty much extrapolate, but you'd actually see the actual claims that they were making. Now's the problem, because if I have to stipulate, if I'm JP Morgan Chase, if I'm Citigroup, if I'm Bank of America, if I have to stipulate what my actual exposure is, my shareholders will find out how much of the thin ice I was skating on. The reason why AIG was not able to fail, was not too big to fail, It was not too big to fail. And by the way, the banks aren't too big to fail. You hear those words being used in the media. Oh, this financial institution is too big to fail. That's actually not true. It's not about too big to fail. It's about too large a risk of transparency to be allowed to be transparent. That's the real issue. And it turns out that as long as we keep this Ponzi scheme running, where we sell debts to pay off the other investors and we keep running that Ponzi scheme. By the way, it's no mistake that Madoff became public enemy in the media because you have the bad guy, the bad actor, covering up the fact that the real Ponzi scheme is being run between the FDIC and the Treasury and the Fed. Because if you look at what they're actually doing, they're minting money to pay off the investor who's buying the money to pay off the investor, and under any construction of law, that's a Ponzi scheme. We're not actually exchanging value. We're actually resolving the credit problem we face today with the problem we had tomorrow. Now, China, to bring this full circle, is oddly enough in a very now interesting conundrum. And this conundrum involves an element that has not been discussed in any media. That goes back to a decision in 1998 that was taken by the Chinese government, which confronted a very interesting reality, and that was that they understood that to advance their economy and to advance their infrastructure, they needed to purchase high-end technologies from the world's greatest companies. So they went to the GEs and the Siemens and the ABBs and the Alstoms. They went around the world to procure transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, rail, manufacturing, you name it. They wanted to build their infrastructure. The Chinese government established a policy which actually at the time created quite a stir. And that was a program called mandatory technology transfer, which meant that when you sold something to China, you actually not only had to sell the thing that they were buying, but you actually had to sell the underlying technology, the know-how, the ability to actually understand how these things worked. Now, in a bit of a fool's bargain, a number of US and European companies wanted the money bad enough that they said, okay, we'll throw technology into these sales. Ironically, what happened over about a 10-year procurement period is China optioned the innovation future of the United States and Europe. Now, if you think about the credit dynamic, and you understand that in credit environments you have this collateral need, and you understand that the collateral need in a credit environment says that I need to have satisfaction that one day you're going to be able to repay whatever the debt facility, whatever the credit facility obligation is, with future productivity, and you overlay the fact that now China not only has the debt that we've sold to it, but they also have the innovation optionality of our largest corporations, which they own by contract. You have a very interesting dynamic that this world has probably never really seen before. Because now we have a situation where one of two equally unacceptable options confront us. If a General Electric, if a Siemens, if an Alstom says, well, we didn't really sell our creative stuff to China, they have a breach of contract problem with China. That's not a good outcome. Because if they didn't really deliver what they said they were delivering, and they really held back all of their creativity, then they failed to deliver something which was material in the contract, which means we get to restate all of the earnings of all of the major corporations that have done business with China. Hardly a desirable option. On the other side, the companies can all say, yeah, we really did sell it to China. All of our innovation, all of our creativity, all of the baseline platforms for creating these great technologies that China has purchased, in which case, when the Obama administration comes along and says, let's build an innovative future, have they actually considered the fact that the title holders on the innovation for our domestic industries and for the innovations that underpin those industries is actually not held by the United States anymore. It's held by our senior secured lender.